Good evening, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Roosevelt House. My name is Annie Polland. I'm from the Tenement House, not the Roosevelt House. But it's wonderful to see you. I'm sure, I had this very interesting journey just now from Orchard and Delancey to 65th and Park. And again, these institutions seem on the surface, and certainly with regard to architecture, very dissimilar. And I want to spend a few minutes before we start our panel talking about why we're partnering together, because I think there are really important links between the Tenement Museum and Roosevelt House, links that have to do with history and the way that the people who lived and worked here connected to the people who lived and worked in the tenements and thought of them in the way that they were fashioning government. And then the second is how we teach history and how history is taught at Hunter. So this is the apartment of the Baldizzi family. And the Baldizzi family was Italian-American. They had come from Sicily. Adolfo Baldizzi came in 1924 from Palermo. He had left his wife, he came in 1923. He left his wife, Rosaria, behind. And the idea, like with so many immigrant groups, was that one person goes ahead, works, gets a foothold, sends for their spouse, and they go on. But what had happened after Adolfo came was that the 1924 Johnson-Reed law was passed, severely, drastically reducing the number of Italian immigrants, among others, Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, to add to the already very restrictive Asian quotas that were on the books. And so Rosaria wasn't able to come, they thought, but she did come. In 1925, she came with a fraudulent passport, and so kind of lived in this house for many years with this kind of undocumented situation. And I just wanted to point out, does anyone see next to the mirror, I don't know if it's clear enough, the portrait that's next to the mirror? In their home, there are a lot of religious artifacts. There are portraits of people from the Bible and elsewhere, but anyone notice who's next to the mirror? Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? That he was so important to so many Italian-American families because in the 1930s, he was bringing in these immigrant groups into the kind of American fold, and many of them revered him for that. So you see in here, and the story goes that Rosaria, his wife, Adolfo's wife, wouldn't let him place FDR higher than the saints that were pictured, elsewhere in the home. And this was important in Jewish American households as well. There was a saying, Die Welt, jene Welt, Die Welt, jene Welt und Roosevelt. This world, the other world, and Roosevelt, right? Like that this was so important to so many people who were here. And likewise, right, and I referred to the kind of the work that was happening here. The panelists were just in the library upstairs. And that was the library where, when FDR was forming his cabinet to assume presidency, he invited Frances Perkins to talk about becoming the Secretary of Labor. And she, as the story goes, gave him a lot of demands of what she wanted to do if she were going to become into this office, create Social Security and all sorts of other wonderful things. She wasn't able to do immigration. At that point was under the labor, under the portfolio of labor. And she wasn't able to do anything dramatic because it was the Depression. She wasn't able to do anything about these 1924 laws because, of course, Congress would have to do that, and they didn't. Although they did later, and we'll hear about it. But she was able to create a loophole that enabled, and Professor Mae Ngai writes about this in her book, that enabled, I think, about 58,000 undocumented Europeans to basically travel to Canada and come back as citizens. This was called a pre-examination program. And so we know that Rosaria Baldizzi comes to the country and eventually becomes naturalized in because of the work that was done by Frances Perkins and by the Roosevelt administration more broadly. So there are these historical ties. Like, again, we're not going to wander through this building and find pictures of the Baldizis here. But the ideas of what was happening was so important to the people living in the tenements. And the people living in the tenements were incorporated into the ways that people were thinking about the federal government in this time. And the second thing I wanted to talk about, and this is pictures of the Baldisi family, and we see Frances Perkins. And these are actually the objects of Hunter students who tell their stories, who are learning about immigration through classes that Hunter holds. And I'm fortunate enough to teach one of their classes. And I always have the students, they learn about the immigrant families that lived in our building at the Tenement Museum, ranging from the 1860s to the 1980s. And then they go home and they pick an object that tells their family story and they research it. And that's called Your Story, Our Story. So these are some of their work. And then the final thing that they're supposed to do is to create a tenement museum that connects to a wave of post-1965 immigration. We're going to hear tonight about the 1965 law, but and how it so radically changes New York. And so, of course, when they're picking the neighborhood that they're going to put their tenement museum in, and of course, it doesn't have to be an actual tenement structure, it could be any kind of structure, they're picking places in Queens and in the Bronx. And this just gives you a sense of some of the wonderful, stories. As some examples, a Bangladeshi student who picks Ozone Park, a Pakistani student who picks Park Chester, the Bronx, and an Egyptian student who picks Astoria to talk about Little Egypt. And so the teaching that happens at Hunter, as well as the way that we focus on families and family stories, helps to influence the ways that these students put together and to understand themselves in New York, but to also teach others about the New York that they inherit. And again, that New York that they inherit has so much to do with what we're going to learn about tonight with this 1965 law. So I want to introduce Margaret Chin, professor of sociology here at Hunter College, the author of Sewing Women and Stuck and so many wonderful articles, who's going to kind of take everything away and lead us into the 1965 law. But it's wonderful for the Tenement Museum to be here, and we love our partnership with Hunter, and we're excited to learn more about this 1965 law.
Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you, Hunter College and Roosevelt House, for letting us do this program here with the Tenement Museum. It's very exciting for this partnership. It's the second time the Tenement Museum has been here doing a program, so all good so far and all good for the future too. So let's start. I want to introduce our panel very briefly. You have huge bios on your chairs. So first, all the way down at the end, we have Joe Salvo, who is the former chief demographer of New York City and who has a lot of tidbits about New York City, statistics, and all the neighborhoods. Great stuff. Next, we have Nancy Foner, who was a former distinguished professor and distinguished professor emerita here at Hunter College in the Department of Sociology, also on the board of the Tenement Museum. Next, we have Mae Ngai, who is the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and Professor of History at Columbia University, and also a board member of the Tenement Museum. And I have to add, I'm also a board member of the Tenement Museum, just so you know. Yeah. Yeah, so actually, can you go back to the intro slide of the Liberty Island, please? So I want to ask Nancy. Well, at first I want you to look at the slide. Yes, this slide. I want you to look at this slide, and I want Nancy here to situate the scene for us. Look at the photo of President Johnson here on Liberty Island. He's here signing the 1965 law. Can you situate the scene? What is going on here?
The signing. Oh, whoops, I have to do this, right? Okay. Well, we see the signing of the 1965 Act, which is what we're going to be talking about this evening. But before we get to 65, we want to just set the stage, just a very, very little, to understand how this was revolutionary, and a really important act that was revolutionizing the American immigration system and really led to this, was a key factor leading to this enormous immigration that we've had since 1965. And what the 1965 Act did was that it abolished the national origins quotas that had been in effect and had been legislated by 1924 legislation. We're going to hear more about that, but I just want to say, just to begin, that 1924 Act, by setting up, it set up national origin quotas so that each country had different quotas, and it was meant and designed to cut back severely immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. And to talk about New York, I mean, that was before 1924, for many decades, the major immigrants coming to New York were Eastern European Jews and Southern Italians. So the act had a huge effect, and also basically gave tiny quotas to most of the rest of the world, and pretty much ended Asian immigration finally. And so that in 1965, the law abolished these quotas. We'll hear about the details of it later. But I think I just wanted to say that I think that we often in America and the United States, we think about the 1960s, we talk about the 1960s, and typically we think civil rights, right? Which obviously was critical. We think gay empowerment, we think women's liberation. We don't usually think 1965 Immigration Act doesn't get much play. And actually, it changed the face of America. It led to the immigration of millions and millions of people, and it changed where they were coming from. And certainly, it's had an enormous impact on New York City in terms of the immigration has dramatically increased since '65. New groups came, and it's had an impact on every aspect, really, of New York life, from the politics to the economy to racial and ethnic composition of the population. And we're going to be talking about all that. So I'm going to now hand it back to, I don't know how I do this, hand it back to Margaret.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to turn over to Mae, our historian. So in thinking about the 1965 law, and basically there must have been a lot of back and forth going on. They're debating what was needed to reform immigration in the 1960s. If you think about the world, there were liberation movements going on worldwide, civil rights protests in the United States. So Mae, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what this Hart Cellar Act was, how did it get passed, what was the main provisions, and tell us about the unintended consequences.
Okay. So Nancy mentioned the 1924 National Origins Act. It was a deliberate attempt to restrict immigration of Italians and Jews and Hungarians, etc. That law put, for the first time, a numerical ceiling on all immigration. Before that, there was no limit to how many people could come. It set it at 150,000, which was 15% of the pre-World War I annual average, 15%. There were 1 million people who came to the United States 1914, 1915, etc. And it had a 3-part border policy. It had different policies for different borders. For the Atlantic, it had a system of restriction based on national origin quotas, which was heavily discriminatory. For the Pacific, it had an exclusion policy, no Asians, full stop. And for the Western Hemisphere, it had a policy that was exempt from numerical quotas, so technically no limit on how many people could come. But by setting up this whole system, you now needed to go through an official port of entry and show a visa. So Mexican workers who had been crossing the borders informally for years, for decades, they didn't want to pay the fee for the visa. They didn't want to have to go through inspection, which was humiliating. So they just came in anyway, and that made them undocumented, right? For the first time, you have undocumented people. And you had a border patrol that was formed after that act. So this law really cut into people's sense of who they were, right? If we're not wanted in this country is how people were, that's what the law was signaling to them. So there were a lot of efforts to change the law, but nothing happened until well after World War II. And there was a reform movement that grew after World War II, comprised of the European Americans whose grandparents or parents had been discriminated against by this law. And the interesting thing is that by the time you get to the 1950s, certainly by the 1960s, you have a fair degree of socioeconomic mobility among those European ethnic groups, right? So just looking at wages, the wages of Jews and Italians approaches 90 to 95% of native-born white workers, right? So that's not to say that discrimination is over, completely, but there's a fair amount of economic and social integration. So these Europeans or descendants of European immigrants, they feel the quotas are, in the words of one of them, a badge of inferiority on us. It's telling us that our people are not wanted, and they wanted to change it. Actually, there was not a big push for migration from Europe right after World War II. You have the Marshall Plan, right? Europe is war-torn, it's rebuilding, so you don't have a lot of demand for immigration, but the quotas stand as an insult to these communities, and they want it changed. And they're not actually able to change it until 1965, when Johnson is president, and in 1964 you have a supermajority in the Congress, right? You have 2/3 of the Congress is Democratic, and that's why not only the Immigration Act passes, but also the Civil Rights Law of 64, the Voting Rights Law of 65, et cetera. So what does this law, the new law, do? It updates the ceiling from 150,000 to 250,000. That's actually not a big increase. It's the same proportion to population, accounting for population growth. Repeals the national origin quotas, which was the main objective of the reformers, and it replaces it with a system where every country has the same number. It's not a quota, but no country can have more than 7% of the total. And that worked out to 20,000. Now today, the total is 425,000. It's not even that big an increase if you consider how much the country's grown. But if you spread it out, 7% is only 26,500. So it's actually a fairly low ceiling. And then it set up a system of preferences within that 7%, or within the total. 75% would go to family members of citizens and green card holders, 20% for skilled workers, and 5% for refugees. Now, there's a refugee law that was passed in 1980, so that's not in the law anymore, but they did add a diversity quota of 55,000. They added that in 1990 because actually they wanted more white people to come. So it was designed for countries that didn't have a large sending history. And, well, we can get into this later. The people who used it actually, it did include Europeans, but it also included Africans. And it eliminated the Western Hemisphere exemption. So I just want to talk a little bit about what the intention of the law was. It was to correct this insult against the European immigrant communities, but it was intended to be a symbolic correction, right? And that's evident in the low ceiling that's set, very low ceiling. And this is a time you have an expanding economy, right? We need workers in this country, but it's a very low ceiling. And it's also suggested by the family preferences, right? If the preferences go to relatives of citizens, mostly to citizens, those are going to be the people who are already here. And there was a lot of discussion in the Congress, well, what about the Asians? The Asians are going to come. And people said, don't worry. They have so few here that they don't have that many there aren't going to be that many family members, so don't worry about it. So this law is often called a law of unintended consequences. Because what happened? What happened is that first, with Mexico getting a quota of 20,000, there was many more people that wanted to come. So you had the development of unauthorized migration, right? Huge numbers of people coming without a visa, without papers. And then you had Asians who used the occupational categories. So I was at a program in North Carolina last week, and a woman who is South Asian, she said, you know, my uncle, my father's brother, came in 1971 as an engineer. He came under the occupational category. Over the next 15 years, he brought 13 siblings to the United States as under the family preferences, right? So this was an example of what happened across many Asian ethnic groups. So the thing I want to say, though, about this unintended consequence, right, of large numbers of Latinos, many of whom are undocumented, large numbers of Asians who use the occupation category and then bring family members over. What I want to say about that is the symbolism of the act was really a symbolism to repair the racism against Eastern and Southern Europeans, right? It was a kind of reckoning that the law had been bad and now we're going to correct it. But there was no reckoning of past racism towards Mexicans or Latinos or Asians. There was no reckoning that how we had treated these groups in the past was bad and now we're going to fix it. In fact, they were telling each other, don't worry, they're not going to come. So that when so many people did come, legally and illegally, you saw instances across the last 50, 60 years of backlash, right? They're not supposed to be here. We didn't really want them to come. And a lot of the old racial stereotypes became reproduced. So we can talk about that more later, but that's just to give you some background on the law.
I just want to make sure, if you look at, I'll be very quick, really quick. There were, in terms of the numbers and the preferences, also close relatives of US citizens can come in without any limits. And that's why in many years recently, we've experienced, 1 million or more immigrants coming to the US. I just wanted to make that.
Yeah. Citizens.
So so the number set by law is 420,000, but in fact, there are 1 million new green cards issued every year. And that's the relatives of citizens. And it's also people who are here who adjust their status. An immigrant marries a citizen, they can become a citizen.
Right, exactly. So Joe, I want to move on to what's going now in New York City. So let's take a look at the demographic overview of New York City.
You've just gotten a primer on the law, 1920s, 1960s. What I'm showing you here, let me just say this at the outset. I'm going to talk about race groups. Race groups are very diverse. There are tons of subgroups, but in order to present this, to give you a general feel, I want to use the major race groups, okay? If you go back to 1900, hard to believe, right after incorporation, New York City had 3.4 million people. By 1930, the number was 6.9 million. Queens alone had 100,000 maybe around the turn of the century, went up to 1 million by 1930, okay? So most of that was done on the heels of European immigration, all right? So the increase in population in the city mirrors essentially the growth in the population from Southern and Eastern Europe heavily. Then we get to the 1930s, the Depression, the impacts of the 20 legislation that you just heard about. And what we have is continued population growth, but starting to wane. The white population starts to wane. Again, white European, basically. At the same time, city's pop continues to go up a bit. Migration from the south, heavily black, coming up to the northern cities. Migration from the island of Puerto Rico, okay? And so we see the city's population by 1950, 60 ends up in that 7.98 million range, okay? But look what happens now. Over time, the European component, the white European component has diminished. And what we see are increases in black population, Hispanic population, and most recently, Asian population. These become the components of population of the city over time. Next slide, please. Now, if you take a look at the composition, again, these are gross groups. 88% of the population in 1950 was essentially European white, okay? In 1950, this calculation of 23%, what we call a diversity index, if you pick any two people at random in the population in 1950, the probability that they would be in different groups, different race groups, was about 23%, okay? Now, over time, with the component of the population that is essentially white European diminishing, and growth in all the other major race groups, by the time you get to 2020, that figure becomes 75%. In other words, pick two people, there's a more than 3/4 chance that there are members of different race groups. It's testimony to the increased diversity of the city's population. You see the impact in 1960, the 65 Act, intended or unintended, it produced this change in the city's population, which to this day means that no group dominates, okay? And again, this is a generalization. No group dominates. I'm gonna stop.
Thank you, Joe. And so we have the data now. So why do people come here? So I'm turning over to Nancy. Why and what do they do here?
Okay. Why do they come here? I'm thinking of New York City, right? Not just the U.S. Okay. And this is a question it's a question I ask myself. I ask my students actually at Hunter. You know, why did your family come to New York? Because actually New York is a really expensive city, right? Housing is incredibly expensive. It's a city that has enormous economic inequality. Decent housing, we know, is in short supply. So what's drawing all these immigrants to come to New York? Well, often it's because they have relatives and friends here, okay, who help sponsor them, who help them get housing to begin with, and to help them get jobs. There are also the presence of ethnic communities for practically every, many groups, which means that they can live in areas where there are familiar languages, they can worship at congregations that are familiar, find familiar foods. Also, I think and another big draw of New York, by the way, is that it's not a car-dependent city. So even though it's expensive to rent an apartment, you don't need a car or two cars. And I think that's important. But also, maybe above all, is that there are jobs here. Because immigrants wouldn't be coming if they couldn't get work. I mean, that's why they're coming. They're coming on the whole because they want to make money, they want to do better for themselves, and overwhelmingly, they want to do better for their children. And so they can get work. And now this sort of slips over to the fact that they are really critical to New York's economy, and they're actually a generator of jobs. And I just want to go through just parts that I think are really noteworthy and should be mentioned. So immigrants are literally building the city. They are nearly 2/3 of the workers in the city's construction industry. They're not most of them, they're most of the construction workers and laborers in the city, but they're also painters and plumbers. And a figure that you might be surprised by, they're 1/3 of the architects in the city and half of the electrical engineers. In the restaurant industry, well, we all know that probably here, right? The food in New York is much better because of immigrants, and we can go to find many cuisines. Immigrants not only create new restaurants, but they create a whole range of small businesses, which also, by the way, create jobs. The healthcare sector is highly dependent on immigrants, and the healthcare sector is a key part of New York City's economy. From those who change beds in hospitals and nursing homes, and to those who are physicians. And again, just a few of the figures to show how dependent we are in New York on immigrants. 4/5 of the city's home health aides are immigrants, 4/5. More than half of the registered nurses, 53%, and nearly, this might surprise you even more, nearly half, 43% of all physicians. So, this is just some of the jobs that they do. Immigrants, I just want to also say, because this is a question that often comes up, are not hurting native-born workers in terms of the economy. This is, economists overwhelming, this is the consensus among economists. Among other things, they increase demand for goods and services because they use services, they buy goods, they create jobs in many cases for the native-born and establish many small businesses. So, the immigrants are very important to the economy, and we depend on them. And we're lucky that they come here in such large numbers.
Okay, Joe, I want you to add to that.
Yeah, I want to go back to this slide just to make the case in point. What Nancy was saying earlier, if you go back to the city's population in 1980, the city's population we lost over 700,000 people in the city of New York during the 1970s, all right? There were, through suburbanization, we lost something like 2 million people left during that period. During the 70s, remember many of you, the fiscal crisis, the really difficult period in the city, bankruptcy being contemplated and so on, we got 800,000 immigrants in the 1970s. The point I want to make is that immigration is relative to the point of origin as well as the point of destination. While things look bad here, or we complain and things are really difficult, in many of the countries that people are coming from, it is extremely difficult and a good decision to actually come into a city which was in pretty bad shape in the 1970s. That's one point I want to make. The other point I want to make is that when you take a look at these major groups that we have now, and you look at the Black population, you see West Indian, you see African, most recently the African population, the West Bronx, for example, by Yankee Stadium. The Asian population, the top groups in the city are Chinese and Dominican. Think about that. If you go through the top 5, look at who we have. Chinese, Dominican, we have Jamaica, Mexico, and Ecuador. And then you go to the top 10, and you have Bangladesh. Think about the mix of people within these groups. I don't want to overgeneralize this by using these gross groups. Hispanic is Puerto Rican, okay, as well as Dominican, some of the top groups, and all of the countries in Latin America, in South America, certainly, that we now have in the city. So this distribution that you see here really understates the level, the mix that we have here, as represented in the groups that I just mentioned. And when things are difficult in the home countries, as they are for many of these people, coming here, despite the circumstances we see, it makes sense. It's a logical choice.
Thank you. And then now we're going to turn back to all these new groups coming to the city, and the portraits have been painted. But then, we hear the talk every single day that immigrants just take from America and don't give back. So Nancy mentioned the job, Joe mentioned all the immigrants from all the races. So Mae, talk a little bit about the economic impacts and how it all works together.
Right. Well, so Nancy, I think, already explained that immigrants don't take jobs from Americans, native-born Americans. But I want to take a little step back and look at how New York City has changed over the last 60, 70 years. So after the 1965 Act was passed and immigrants started to come in from more diverse places and larger numbers, some of the jobs that they were filling were created by expansions in parts of the New York's economy. So the 60s was a time when you saw the expansion of public hospitals, right? They haven't been with us, Bellevue maybe has been there forever, but a lot of the city hospitals are created in the mid-20th century. And so there was a whole industry where jobs were opened, and a lot of the people who filled jobs as nurses, X-ray technicians, doctors, etc., were immigrants. There was also in the New York City area, maybe not exactly in the city itself, but there was a burgeoning industries in the area of telecommunications. There was Bell Labs in New Jersey, pharmaceutical companies. These also drew immigrants that had higher education degrees. But then the other thing that happened starting in the 80s and 90s was something that probably most of you are familiar with, was the growth of the finance industry in New York. And so you have our famous one percenters, you know, the Wall Street finance guys. They're not all guys, but they're mostly guys, I think. So you have the growth at that end in terms of, well, not people, numbers of people, but in terms of their section of the economy. And then you had a huge service industry that grew in large part to service the upper middle class and the upper class, right? So restaurants, nannies, dog walkers, you know, small businesses, masseuses, right? All kinds of jobs in the service sector that actually is an extension of the finance sector. And the third thing that is going on at the same time is that you have a shrinking of the middle, the shrinking of the manufacturing base of New York City. So a lot of you may remember Long Island City used to be an area with factories. Right now it's the hipsters have taken over, right? It's art galleries, or Williamsburg is now the hipsters. These are areas that used to be manufacturing areas in New York. And so you have a loss of jobs. Many of those jobs were held by African Americans and native-born white Americans. So immigrants didn't take their jobs, but there were new jobs that were created that immigrants helped to fill. And I think that what that suggests is that you have, among most immigrant groups, and it varies by group to group, you have some that come who are higher skilled, have more education, and work in professional areas. And then you have a lot of people who come who might actually have a high level of education, but they work in the service sector. So for example, people come from Pakistan. 42% of immigrants from Pakistan have a bachelor's degree or higher, but 50% of them work in low-wage jobs. 50% of all Pakistanis work in low-wage jobs. So your taxi cab driver might have a PhD for all you know, right? But they can't get a job with the degree that they have. Russians, Bangladeshi, Chinese, or all other groups whose education does not translate into their employment. They work in the service sector in some way. So.
Yeah, that's good. I just want to add one point to that. So the other way of thinking about it with the top layer, the 1%, and the bottom, is that they actually need each other. Because, you know, the 1% oftentimes need that babysitter, and they'll hire whoever they can find. And it fuels a whole nother economy below. So it's not that the jobs, they're taking jobs away, immigrants. You actually have immigrants at the top too, but they fuel each other and they actually make the city hum. Because all of the payments that go to, well, the money earned by either the top or the bottom, they actually go and buy groceries and spend it again, and it goes back into the economy, churning over and over again, fueling, you know, everything that happens in New York City pretty much, right? So now that we have that picture, I'm going to turn over back to Joe. I want to take a look at these neighborhoods, right? So we have, you know, 5 boroughs. We have really diverse neighborhoods too. So what's going on? Where do all these people live?
One of the things that the kind of research that I've done over the years with my colleagues, what we've done is we've taken a look at the neighborhoods of New York, and they can be defined in various ways. I mean, certainly that's interesting just to undertake that. If you take a look at the city's 200 and something neighborhoods that were created at the Department of City Planning to study the neighborhoods of the city, and you take a look at the 2,000 geographic areas that you call census tracts okay? One of the things you can do, and that we've done, is you go back to 1970 and you ask, how many of those tracts have multiple groups of people living in those geographic areas? So I showed you the chart before, and when you're dealing with 75 or 80% of the tracts that are European, principally, you ask the question, how many of those census tracts have three or more groups where no one is a majority, okay? Truly mixed situations. Out of the 2,000 tracts back in 1970, 55 can be categorized that way. You saw the chart before about the increased mix. By 2010, the number was 700, okay? But we have to ask the question, what does this mean? Are people really living with each other? And I want to go back to something that my colleagues mentioned earlier. If you look at some of these groups that are living in these neighborhoods, in some parts of the world, these groups are in conflict. These groups are at each other. But somehow in New York, there's a tolerance, and that tolerance is based on a theme you're going to hear tonight, I think, multiple times. It's based on the social mobility, not only of the immigrants, but of the children of immigrants. The immigrants who come here for themselves, for economic betterment, but they come here for their children, okay? And those children will go to the City University of New York. Those children will work in a business and maybe someday own the business. They will rehabilitate housing. Well, New York's housing stock is old, and we need this constant injection, this cycling of people, okay? People come and go in New York City at a high rate, and it's very important that that churning continue, okay? So there are neighborhoods in New York which are characterized by certain, what we call dominance. All you got to do is go to northeastern Queens, go to Whitestone, go to Flushing, parts of the West Bronx. I mean, we could go through a whole list of neighborhoods that are categorized as being Dominican, as being Mexican, as being Puerto Rican, as being Chinese. I mean, we can do that, and there are indeed many neighborhoods like that. But increasingly what we see are people who are coming together in various mixes that, for me, is a sign of great hope, that maybe we can go and look forward with hope and optimism that we do encourage people to live together by virtue of what you've been hearing about the economic factors and the like.
I think, thank Joe, and also for his research showing, the multiracial neighborhood, the growth of these, I don't know, you called them integrated neighborhoods in one point, right? In the book that I edited, you had that phrase.
I'm a little nervous about using the word integrated. I know, especially in the presence of, I certainly get that.
No, I mean, but it showed the growth of these neighborhoods where you had different groups, but mixed. But what you also showed, and what others show, is that these mixed neighborhoods are overwhelmingly Latino, Asian, and white. And you see that one group is not in there so much. And I think we have to also recognize that because we're talking about Black people and Black residents of New York. And by the way, not just, they include a lot of immigrants, because New York City has a very large Black immigrant population of West Indians and Africans. It's a very significant population here. And if you look at the neighborhoods, you see that on the whole, they're not part of those mixed neighborhoods. And they have high levels of segregation from whites. And what you see, and I've seen in my own research, because I focused initially, I was a student of West Indian migration. And I would see when I was doing my research in Brooklyn, I would go to a neighborhood and I met one woman and she had just moved into Canarsie. This was in the early 80s. And she told me that nobody had come to say hello to her, that nobody would speak to her. She moved there because she wanted a better housing, she wanted better schools for her children, but she felt that she was not welcomed. If you go to Canarsie now, and certainly the street where she lived, you would find that it is a heavily Black neighborhood, because what tends to happen in New York is Blacks, and they're often Caribbean Blacks, who move because they come here to do better and they want to do better for their children, and they're willing to go into a neighborhood that is virtually all white and to move there, which is, heroic in many ways. They move in, and what happens is the whites begin to move out, no new whites move in, and other Black people begin to see it as a welcoming place and move in. And so what you have, and you see this in New York in many neighborhoods, become increasingly Black over time. And they don't often, I mean, we may see this as, I often say this, by the way, to my Hunter students, and it's very interesting that the only people in the room who are going like this are the Black students, because they know, they experience it, and the others are just sort of sitting there. But I mean, it is you can see it, by the way, on the subways often at certain stops, right?
But Nancy,
Yeah.
what about Harlem, which has been heavily gentrified?
By whites.
By whites.
That's the different process. As is, yes. That's gentrification. That's the other side. But what we don't, yes, those neighborhoods, yes. And Harlem had not been, was not thriving when, there was a lot of empty housing. But so, I mean, we do have, yes, so you would see that. And that raises another question, because you would say, wow, look at all these Blacks and whites living together. But the other question is, for this whole issue, and just to throw it out, I mean, is we really need, here's a question where we need more research, because we really don't know. I mean, there's been a lot of demography in New York and other cities about the growth of these mixed neighborhoods, but we don't really know too much about what really goes on in them, right? Yeah, we need to know more about what happens in these neighborhoods in terms of what kinds of relations. I mean, there's a sociologist in Britain who talks about commonplace diversity, in which she says, because Britain is like New York, very, very diverse, and what she says is that, well, in public space, people are used to each other, seeing each other in public space, but in private, they tend to interact mostly with people of the same race and ethnicity and social class. So,
To mention about some of the research we're working on, in Queens, especially Southeast Queens, there are Asian and Black communities that are coming together in ways that perhaps signal a change. One of the things we keep looking for is, what does the future hold? Which way are we headed? How many of those mixed tracks are on their way to something else versus the kind of the current situation holding, where people maybe don't leave. Maybe people, like in Southeast Queens, heavily homeowning, talking about Laurelton, Springfield Gardens, Baisley Park. These communities are experiencing a transition right now because there's blackout migration, okay? The Black population, like the white population, is aging. We have new African immigrants, but the Black West Indian community is very big, and they're demonstrating out migration. And what you have is an influx of Asian groups, South Asian groups, and we're looking to try to get an answer to what Nancy is raising. What goes on in the decision-making process? What coalitions form? One of the questions we really want to ask, which I kind of, in my post-city planning role now, which I can ask, how does anybody get anything done in these places when you have so many different people? And the answer is, they develop a common thread. Perhaps it's quality of life. Everybody's concerned about that, right? So maybe they form those coalitions that might transcend, how is this for Pollyannish? May transcend all of the divisiveness that might come about as a result of those historical tensions that tend to work themselves through neighborhoods.
Thank you. Those are great answers for the neighborhoods. But now we're going to go back to the national scene now. So, we are, any of you can answer this one. So every day we hear about limits to immigration, the H-1B visas, ICE coming around, chasing out legal and unwanted, right? Immigrants terrorizing everybody. What does this decline mean for New York, if it happens, and for our nation?
Start. I mentioned earlier, I mean, we've heard about how important immigration is to New York. We have to think about what I've always said, maybe some of you have heard me say this before. New York City is all about population churning. It's not about adding people to this monolith. It's about people coming and going in very large numbers, a couple of 100,000 a year in either direction, in and out of the city. Neighborhoods experience this. There's a dynamic. It's an influx of people with desires to do better, and influx of energy that drives the city's economy, okay, and creates the kind of job description that you heard earlier about immigrants participating in the economy and so on. That churn is vital to us. Here's the current situation. The city grows historically because of something called natural change or natural increase. More births than deaths. Very important. We generally export people to the rest of the country net. More people go to the rest of the country than come in. It's been true for decades. We grow because of immigration, which counteracts the domestic loss, and because of natural increase, natural change, okay, more births and deaths. What's happening right now is that the number of deaths is increasing because the population's aging, boomers, aging. The number of births is not increasing. It's going down, or it's kind of in a range, but likely to go down. Why? Because half the births are foreign-born women. So if you cut immigration, what ends up happening is you don't have the direct effect of immigrants, you don't have the secondary effect of the births to foreign-born mothers, and we're looking at a potentially worrisome situation from the standpoint of population growth, because New York is driven by its immigrant population. And without those immigrants, the demography of New York is going to change.
Well,
yeah.
and America as a whole. I mean, were it not for immigrants, we would have a declining birth rate. Were it not for immigrants.
We do have a
And-
declining birth rate.
But I want to, so I think we've shown, that immigrants contribute to the city. I think they contribute to the nation, not only the economy, but also I think a culture, right? We have a more vibrant and diverse culture because of migration. A poll was done by Gallup in July that 80% of the people polled said they think immigration is good for the United States. Only 35% of the people polled said they supported the present administration's campaign against immigrants. 35%, that's roughly the size of the MAGA base, right? 35%. So I want to talk a little bit about the politics of what's going on. Why is this all ICE going on rampages everywhere? And I want to say, we in New York need to get ready. We need to be ready. They haven't come yet in big numbers. They're coming. We're going to elect a new mayor in this city next month. And after that happens, they're going to send ICE and I don't know what else. And what we have seen this summer in LA, what we've seen in Chicago just in the last several weeks, it cuts me to the bone that they could storm a building in the middle of the night and drag children and families out in zip ties. They stop people on the street. They stop people in courthouses. That's happening here in New York at Federal Plaza. They are snatching asylum seekers after their hearings and detaining them. Much of this is not legal, but they're doing it anyway. And there are ICE Act enforcement in New York, but nothing on the scale of the ferocity that we're witnessing right now in some other cities. And we cannot be complacent. This is going to happen, guys. It's going to happen. And I do want to say that one of the things about Chicago that I've been watching is the response of communities. You know, Homan went after Chicago right after Trump was elected, because the mayor of Chicago went on the radio and said, these are your rights. You do not have to open your door if they don't have a warrant. These are your rights. And Homan accused the city of Chicago of harboring criminals because they were educating people and they were frustrating the efforts of immigration enforcement, because people learned that they don't have to open the door if they don't have a warrant. And none of these guys, all the guys with masks on, they don't have warrants. They're just snatching people. So you have this mass education going on, public service announcements, the radio sides of buses saying, these are your rights. And neighborhoods are organized. They had, ICE was doing things in Rogers Park, which is in Chicago, a heavily immigrant community, both Latino and South Asian. They were snatching mothers out of cars who had gone to pick up their kids from school, okay? But the community was organized. They had school crossing guards with whistles to warn people that ICE was coming. They chased ICE out of the community by surrounding them and chasing them. In Chicago, the ICE officers cannot use a bathroom in a restaurant because no one will let them in, right? Or sell them a meal. And so are we going to be prepared to confront this? Because it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. And in New York, there are a lot of immigrant groups and community groups who are organized. You may not see it day to day, but the churches are organized, synagogues are organized, community groups are organized. They have know your rights trainings all the time. They have mass texting. You know, you belong to a parish, you're on their text thing, you're on their text list. And if ICE, they will tell you if ICE is coming into your neighborhood. But we have to be prepared, and we need to show that we can stand up for our fellow New Yorkers the way Chicago is standing up. So I just want to say that. I hate to say it, but it's coming, and we need to be ready.
I don't want to, it's such an upbeat, I'm not so upbeat, but I'm somewhat. I wanted to end with a sort of, before we go to the questions, right? A little more upbeat, maybe, looking a little more long-term, right? Beyond the present situation in terms of immigration. I mean, I think immigration is not going to end in the United States, and it's not going to end in New York. We need immigrants. Trump may be doing this. Businesses are going to need people to work, and we don't even have agriculture in New York, but the farm industry in the US needs immigrants. We have the demographic situation that Joe talked about. We've got the baby boomers are, as of 2030, they're all going to be over 65. Who's going to take their jobs? We have already we have had for quite a while now, we're not reproducing, and we have lowered fertility at below replacement level. Who's going to care for the elderly? Who's going to care for the elderly? Who's going to pay into Social Security? Where there's going to be a growing need for immigrant workers. Now, that's not to say we don't know how they're going to come in. They may have temporary worker programs. We don't know politically, because one of the things, maybe just to backtrack, I mean, New York has needs for immigrants, but New York doesn't make immigration policy. That's done at the federal level. So in terms of who can come in. But I do think that we, you know, looking down the line.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. I don't want to be too negative, but what you're seeing, snatching people in the street, it's spectacle. It is a spectacle to terrorize people and to terrorize people who are not immigrants as well. And so here's the thing. I've just published an article, so I did a lot of research on this. When Stephen Miller said we're going to arrest 3,000 people a day, you know how many daily arrests they have? Less than 900. Less than 900. So they are rampaging through the streets, storming down the corridors of the courthouses, but they cannot, okay, so they say they're going to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants. 3 million a day, which is their goal, is 1 million a year. That would take 10 years, even if they could do it, right? It's not, they can't do it. There's too many. And we need them. They're our neighbors, our coworkers, our colleagues, our classmates. And so this is a terror campaign, and there are people being gravely harmed by it. It's not just performance, but I think we have to understand it for what it is. And I think it's part of a broader pattern in terms of what is happening to our democracy. You know, what is happening to our civil liberties. It's not just immigrants. All of us are under threat, I think, at this time. So, but this is, I think, in some ways the leading edge, or one of the leading edges. Maybe there's more. Universities, that's another edge of threat. But I think that, you know, we should be clear that I think these long-term trends are really important because they cannot get rid of all the immigrants. They can't. But they'll scare us all.
Yeah, absolutely. They're trying to scare us all. And then even with the scaring, people will still want to come. There's still people applying to be a foreign student. There are people emailing, will you take me as your student? You know, so that's still going. So it's not like, but yes, this is a spectacle. We have to get ready for it. I completely agree. And I completely agree that the younger people are scared. One student said when he saw the video of Chicago to me, being filmed through a windowsill, he kept thinking of Anne Frank because he just read Anne Frank like 3 years ago. So the Diary of Anne Frank, that's all he could think about, and he couldn't sleep the whole night. So this is what people are feeling in New York City too.
Well, we have to hope at least that we talked about the ways in which New York City is, you know, stands out as a distinctive from other cities. And I guess in one ways we have to hope that New York continues to be distinctive as a fairly welcoming place for immigrants and a place that politically, I mean, certainly with the mayor election coming up, will support immigrants. And, you know, that is one of its features, and it's due partly to the demography of immigration in the city, but also to the long history we have in New York City of welcoming immigrants and also of liberal politics.
Yeah. And
So I think that, you know, I'm trying to
yeah, and we could stand up to, I think we could.
give us a little hope here, right? That we also live in a city that, because it's been an immigrant city and is America's quintessential immigrant city, that it may, you know, it may stand up better. Well, we can hope it's not like Columbia, right? That it stands, it stands, and actually, here we are at the City University of New York, right? Which is another product of immigration, right? And has 250,000 students. So, you know, so I think that we can maybe can take hope from that. And as you were talking about community organizations, but also the distinction, the distinctive qualities of characteristics of New York, due again to its immigrant population and its history.
Yes, we should rally everybody to support the immigrants. So, okay, I'm going to open it up to questions. So maybe somebody can, oh good, you have a mic over there. So I'm gonna count you off for maybe 1, 2, 3 over here on this side. Anybody on this side? So why don't we start with these 3 first? One here.
Thank you. Yes. So recently, it's not the 2 acts that you have been talking about that is fresh in my mind, the 65 and the 24, but the one that's been mentioned is the 1798 Alien and Sedition Act that was invoked. And I wonder, I know that it's bizarre and old and probably completely irrelevant and just an opportunity for spectacle, but the pairing of those words, alien, and sedition, make me think that it makes me think about the word alien, and I'm wondering if you either have commentary on the 1798 Act or just the use of the word alien, and is that something that we should be completely getting rid of? Is it still in use, in technical use in the government?
Well, that's a great question. Alien is a legal term. And I prefer to say non-citizen or people can also, sometimes they say foreign-born, but many foreign-born are citizens. So non-citizen would be maybe the closest word to use, because alien has assumed so many negative connotations. The Alienist Edition Acts actually expired, within a few years. The act that the president invoked was the Alien Enemies Act, which was passed around the same time. And that law says that if there is a foreign invasion or a threat of a predatory invasion by another country, the president can round up people who are citizens of that foreign country without due process. Right, so there has to be an invasion or an imminent invasion by another state, right? Now, when Trump invoked that act, he said Trandagua, the Venezuelan gang, was invading the United States. And that has been struck down in federal court. But they always appeal everything, right? So the final word has not been made. But it was using that act that they sent some 250 Venezuelans to that hellhole in El Salvador without any charge, without any evidence, without any due process. They even refused to turn a plane around that had, a judge had ordered to bring the plane back. The only evidence that they had that these were gang members was that they had tattoos. So there was a famous case of a gay hairdresser who had certain tattoos that were certainly not gang tattoos. So they were just, snatching people up. And when they were finally released, there was some data released about those 250 people. I don't remember the number, but maybe like over 80% had no criminal record whatsoever, no criminal record. And most of them said they were not gang members. So this was just an outright attack, on a community. The building in Chicago that they, jumped out of the helicopters, and that was in a Venezuelan neighborhood. So the reason for the building is that the neighborhood has a lot of Venezuelans. That doesn't add up, right? And anyway, but that's just for the Alien Enemies Act. That's what it is.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the second question right there, your hand is up, and then the fellow next. Yeah.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer. Thank you for the invitation. Just advocating any female leadership tonight. I represent New York State. I am a registered U.S. presidential candidate. I'm the new generation future leader. I am anti-war, so I've been activated as an emergency wartime president to assist with the delegations with the Trump administration. So we have me doing communications with our army to prevent them from, entering these wars that we have been put in. And I'm also assisting in the state capitals of Albany and Hartford, Connecticut, with the Senate Congress defending the immigration system. I myself am Puerto Rican and married to Dominican Republic. And it's 8 years now doing congressional volunteer work. And I've been in the 2020, 2024, and 2028 elections. And any advocacy I can be here. Everything I've been hearing here sounds about right about the Trump administration, but to calm the situation down so everyone feels safe, I am here. I'm here to prevent these things. I'm doing delegations with the police, training the police in their behavior so that they respect the civilians. I'm retraining ICE. I'm in many meetings with ICE, telling them to respect the civilians or they'll lose their federal positions.
Thank you.
I'm doing all these things for you guys, okay? So everything's all right.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm a former colleague of the gentleman over there. I'm the product of 4 immigrant grandparents and an 8-year-old that became my father. What I've noticed is that people with similar backgrounds somehow have a shut the door behind us attitude, and I'm wondering if you could comment. And I'd like to also point a reference. I was a student at another unit of CUNY, 40-odd blocks south of Hunter, and I did a study of the impact of open admissions, which is what we experienced at the time. And one of the questions that I had was on connection, feeling of connection to the city. Jewish students felt connected to New York. Those of what was largely ethnic Catholic groups did not. And Jewish population in the city is about half of what it was 50 odd years ago. I would say the other groups are much smaller as a percentage of New York. So maybe those are like connected kinds of things, but I sort of like wonder, what do you know about how people's attitudes are in terms of whether they're welcoming and open and whether or not they're not?
I was going to say, well, yeah, it's a very
It's a
complicated question.
You know, one of the things, I mean, I too am a grandchild of immigrants, right? But increasingly, you know, I'm getting older. I mean, that generation of people who are the grandchildren of immigrants who came, you know, in the first decade of the 20th century are, you know, we're in the generation there aren't as many of us around. So I think there's, when you say shut the door, you know, I think, I mean, there is, I think, amongst certain groups, as they're here longer and the children grow up, in some cases, they do become and do better. Some of them become more conservative with age. There's also the issue, I mean, Manny is a person who studied Jews in New York, right? But the Jews were a very liberal community in New York, right? Always. And they continued on the whole to be a liberal community. The Italian Americans actually were a group that were more liberal, but over time became more conservative. And often actually, they're often mentioned when we look at the Hispanic population, because people say, well, maybe they'll become like the Italians, and as they do better, they may become less conservative, more conservative over time. We don't really know. I mean, about the future that way. Yeah.
I don't know if you can say this group is more welcoming than that group. I think every group has people who want to shut the door behind them, and has people who are more welcoming. Being a more recent immigrant doesn't necessarily make a difference. I have relatives who are immigrants and they're not so welcoming to others. So I think it varies, and I think it depends on, you know, some of it's culture, some of it's your family, what kind of family you grew up in, how much hardship, you know, people experience themselves or adversity. So I would be very careful about saying this group is more welcoming than that group, or even this generation is more welcoming than that generation. I think you have both things that go on.
On the other hand, we do know over time in New York City that Jews remained heavily Democratic, and Italian Americans moved over to the Republican Party. So whether that equaled welcoming or not, I don't know. But their politics were different.
You have
And
more
so it doesn't
conservative
mean
Jews
every
now too.
single. Yes, because those in New York have changed, because we're getting these very religious Jews, okay. And of course, we've had that, so that's changed the dynamic. But over time, the Eastern European Jews who came to New York, their descendants remained heavily Democratic,
Right.
okay, even though they did better economically, okay. So you could have predicted that over time, they might have become more Republican because they became more affluent as a group. I mean, if we look at, and the question, I mean, we do know that the Italian Americans as a group moved to the Republican
But it should
Party.
also be pointed out that the Democratic Party is not necessarily pro-immigrant.
Right, I was
No,
gonna,
I'm going to say it doesn't necessarily I don't think it translates necessarily into attitudes towards immigrants. But to other political issues.
right, I'm gonna move, I'm gonna move to two more questions there. But just to, there's two on this side and then one over here and then you. But I just want to say the Asian American population, the most recent one, a lot of them moved toward Trump. But then we realized a lot of them are also from those same neighborhoods are voting for Mamdani. And the reasons are, it's not because of parties, but it's because of the policies they each, campaigned on. So you can't always tell based on parties. So I'm going to go over here first and then over there. Okay.
Yeah, I don't, oh, now it's working. Okay, sorry. More as an experience and a comment, I drive for Lyft 2 days a week over in New Jersey. So the population isn't New York, but close enough. And I get a lot of immigrants. I speak Spanish, so what? A little bit, not fluently, but enough. Yeah, a lot of the Hispanic people, this isn't, okay, are telling me that, first of all, if they will talk to me, because they get terrified, they think maybe I'm a Trumper because of how I look. But then once we establish that I'm not, and I can get them to talk, they will tell me that they really thought that they were going to go after the criminals. And they didn't consider themselves criminals. And so they feel as though they've been lied to and hoodwinked, and they're very worried and very concerned. And I think that a lot of what has to happen in the general room here, we're all pretty much similar demographic as me. We need to make people understand that we'll stand by them and we will not allow this ICE terrorism to go unanswered. And we have to call it ICE terrorism. We have to come up with some words. We have to come up with some way to communicate that we're not happy with this. And I think one of the big problems that we've had in the resistance is that we don't have words yet. We need to do some work on that. So anyway, it's a comment as opposed to a question, because I'm dealing with these people all the time. All the healthcare workers, I mean, I'm the one who's doing this driving, right? That's who's taking cars. And they're terrified. They're terrified.
Okay, thank you. Last question over here.
Question for Mr. Salvo. Could you elaborate on the difference in classifying a community as integrated versus being mixed? Are there what are the negatives and positives of the two terms?
We use the phrase melting pot census tracts, and that implies some level of integration, but the jury's out as to how much integration is actually implied there. And if you follow these places over time and they remain stable, then you start asking a question of, these people are living together and decisions are being made within the community. And one of the things we're studying is, how are these decisions made? Who's making them? How did the coalitions form? In other words, do we have integration? We don't really know how many of these are truly integrated areas, but the hopeful sign is that if these persist over time, and you could see the demography says, it gets really tough in a city where no group is dominant to have, completely dominant areas. They don't last too long because other groups move in and mixes and so on. And what makes New York special is that fact. That mix of people at the neighborhood level. You can go throughout the US, you'll find some cities where this happens, but in New York, it's so prevalent and so interesting to study. I don't mean to imply that it's a fait accompli that that we have integration when you have 700 in 2010. We're studying it for 2020 now, and the number's probably grown even more. So we're studying those places to see what makes them tick. That's kind of like my final scientific analysis. Yeah.
The last thing, and then
Last thing, yeah, maybe this is like a homage to a colleague of ours, Richard Alba, who passed away unfortunately several months ago. This is for Richard, right? Another thing looking ahead to the future for these neighborhoods is the rise in mixed unions. That there's, and by the way, we can see this at Hunter, both in the parents of our students and the young people themselves, that one of the dynamics in New York, because there is so much diversity, is that, and they're meeting each other at schools and going to schools together and universities, is that we're seeing, and we see this nationally and we see it in New York, that there are growing numbers of, we call them mixed unions, marriages, whatever, and they're having, and so this is another dynamic that's being injected into, in large part due to immigration, into the future of racial and ethnic difference and diversity. And so I just wanted to add that, and also because Richard focuses so much on mixed unions in his work in terms of looking ahead to the future of race in America. And so I wanted to just to put that in.
good point. Thank you. Thank you. And yes, it's a good way to end. We can look to the future. Yeah, and we shall see. But we have to rally the troops too. Us, rather. We have to rally us. Okay, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Oh, there's a reception one floor up. Sorry, if you want to join us.